Tale Without Tale, an episodic novelette based on a true story by Kinga Blanka Modlishevska. To my family. Chapter 1. Tale Without Tale. On Fern Street, in a quiet corner of suburbia, Claire Emerson stood at the edge of a ruined garden, wrapped in a bathrobe and disbelief. Storms had ravaged her garden, leaving branches scattered across wilted blooms and puddles where her rosebush once stood. A few stray petals clung stubbornly to the broken stems, but most had been beaten down into the mud. She took a step forward, noticing a small, half-buried toy in the dirt, a battered, squeaky bowl. As she sipped her coffee inside, Claire thought about the weather. After weeks of storms, today was clear, with a bright blue sky and a crisp chill in the air. The doorbell broke her thoughts. She opened the door to find a polished woman with a bright smile. "Hi, I'm Sandy," the woman said, her tone cheerful but businesslike. "My husband and I are the neighborhood real estate agents. If you ever think about selling, we'd be happy to help." "Oh, thank you," Claire replied, taken aback. Sandy's gaze flicked to the garden. "Looks like you've had a bit of a rough season out here." She handed Claire a business card with a practiced smile. "Just in case." Claire watched Sandy walk away. Sure, her garden was a mess, but it was her mess. Back in the kitchen, she set her mug down. She stood there a moment longer than necessary, then went to the closet to change. She pulled on her overalls, a long-sleeve shirt, and her favorite worn jacket. She stepped outside again. Overturned pots, broken branches, and dead leaves lay everywhere. She swept mechanically, moving debris from one place to another without deciding where it should go. She caught a shadowy glimpse of something like a dog trotting along beside her. She paused near the fence. That afternoon, Claire cleared away the last of the broken branches and came across a withered stem where a rosebush had once thrived. She knelt beside it and dug into the soil, feeling the ache in her arms and the cool earth beneath her hands. Near the gate where she stored her gardening tools, her gaze caught on something small and brown, a dried, half-buried dog dropping. She stopped. She set the broom aside and went back into the house, the garden unfinished. At home, Claire settled onto the couch with her laptop balanced on her knees. Susie's photo rested on the mantel, caught mid-leap, ears lifted, body tilted toward something unseen. Claire glanced at it, then back at the blank screen. She placed her fingers on the keyboard and began to type. Chapter 2. Culinary Dreams. 16 years earlier, one late afternoon, Claire trudged into her kitchen, her fingers sore from pulling weeds, and her back aching from working in the garden. She was barely through the door when her husband, Nate, appeared. "You okay?" he asked, eyeing her mud-streaked clothes with a raised eyebrow. "Just spent the day wrestling with the garden," she muttered. Nate pulled her into a brief hug. "Sit down. I'll handle dinner tonight." Claire sat, then she said, "I had 2 dogs when I was younger, a poodle named Chica and a mutt named Kuba." She shared a few stories, loosely, the details blurring together. That evening, Claire brought it up again. "What if we looked into getting a dog?" Nate smiled. "But what kind of dog should we get?" he asked. "Oh, I saw one once," Claire said. She described a sleek, tricolored dog with fluffy cheeks and a swishing tail. Within a week, Nate found a local breeder with a litter of tricolor puppies. He showed Claire a picture. "I want that one if it's a girl," she said, pointing. A few days later, Nate received a reply and an invitation from the breeder. He shared the news with Claire. "Make sure it's a female," she said. They had already decided on a name, Suzie. As the time of the puppy's arrival grew closer, Claire moved things around the house. She set a bed against the wall. She placed a few toys on the floor, then shifted them again. Chapter 3. Barn. Nate and his father, Andreas, pulled up to a small barn surrounded by rolling fields. They stepped out of the car, only to be greeted by a rooster barreling toward them with feathers ruffled in indignation. "Watch out!" a tall, rugged man called from the doorway, shooing the bird away. "That one thinks he's the boss around here." Nate shook the man's hand. "I'm Nate, and this is my father, Andreas. We're here for the puppies?" The man, Joe, led them inside. Among the hay bales, a litter of puppies wrestled. "Looks like they're busy in here," Joe said. "They sure are," Nate replied. Nate bent down and reached toward the litter. One of the puppies paused near the edge of the group. She had a black back, a white collar around her neck, and caramel markings on her face and legs. Her navy blue eyes lifted briefly toward him before shifting away. Nate picked her up. She squirmed, then went still, her body warm and solid in his hands. That's when he noticed something unusual. She had no tail. He said nothing at first. The puppy wriggled again, stretching her back legs, then settled. Nate held her, then lowered her back into the hay. He pulled out his phone and called Claire. "Hey," he said. "We're at the breeders. There's a female here." He paused. "One thing, she doesn't have a tail." "What?" Claire sounded surprised, but unfazed. "How come?" Nate glanced at Joe, who shrugged. "The vet usually docks them when they're a few days old," he explained. Claire sighed on the other end of the line. "Well, bring her home. We'll love her as she is, tail or no tail." Chapter 4. First Steps. When Nate and Andreas arrived home with the puppy, Claire greeted them at the door. "Meet Suzie," Nate said. "Oh, dear heavens," Claire gasped as Grandpa Andreas came through the door, his chin smeared with blood. "What happened?" Claire asked. "Suzie happened," Grandpa said, dabbing his chin with a tissue. Claire's attention shifted to Suzie, who had retreated under the kitchen table. She peered out, her body tight as she watched the unfamiliar room. Suzie pressed herself farther under the table. The floor smelled of polish and heat. She whined once. Nate crouched near her. "It's okay," he said. He did not reach for her. Suzie crept forward. Nate let his hand rest on the floor. Suzie moved past it. She sniffed the base of the cabinets and the corners of the room. Claire reached out, but Suzie slipped away and darted back under the table, her body low. She was sniffing the air again. Human scent, wood polish, something faint and bitter. Coffee. Claire knelt and slid a treat across the floor. Suzie watched it before taking it, then backed away. She crept forward again. She sniffed Claire's hand and licked it once, then moved on. Then she saw the staircase. The steps rose sharply from the floor. Suzie approached and placed one paw on the first step. She pulled it back, then tried again. She climbed one step, then another. Halfway up, her paws slid on the wood and she stopped. She looked back at Claire, then she continued. Chapter 5. Breakfast. A few weeks after Suzie's arrival, Claire was busy with paperwork when she spotted an envelope with the American Kennel Club logo. She tore it open, glancing over the information inside. Breed, Australian Shepherd. She called out to Nate. "Honey?" "What's up?" he replied. "I think I mixed up the breeds. I told you to get an Australian Shepherd, but I meant Border Collie. That's probably why Suzie doesn't have a tail." Nate just laughed. "No big deal. She's ours now, tail or no tail." He shrugged with his usual laid-back charm. "Besides, she's perfect just the way she is." The next morning, Claire shuffled into the kitchen in her bathrobe with Suzie behind. "Let's make breakfast, shall we?" Claire said. She cracked eggs into a pan, her spatula clattering as she stirred. Claire placed a bowl of eggs on the floor. Suzie ate, wagging. While Suzie was busy with her breakfast, Claire poured herself a cup of coffee. She took a few sips, then went to check the mailbox. When she returned, her coffee cup was empty. "Nate," Claire called, "did you drink my coffee?" Nate appeared in the doorway. "You know I don't drink coffee." Claire looked down at Suzie. "Did you?" Claire began, then stopped. She picked up the cup from the side table. Susie's ears flicked. "That was a full cup," Claire said. Nate leaned against the counter. Suzie burped. The kitchen went quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. Claire set the empty mug in the sink and poured another. "This one's mine," she said, touching the rim of the cup. Suzie watched. Claire took a sip, then another. Suzie finished her eggs and sat at Claire's feet. Chapter 6. Garage Makeover. It was another day when Claire was buried in paperwork in her home office. She wrestled with budget spreadsheets and inventory lists. Suzie sat just outside the office, her rump planted on the hardwood floor. She let out a huff, then another. Suzie got up and went down the hall. She came back and stopped by the office door. "Nate," Claire called. "Can Suzie keep you company in the garage? She's restless in here." "Send her over," came Nate's voice, muffled by the clatter of tools. The door opened. Suzie darted toward the garage. The garage was cluttered, Nate's tools and half-finished projects covering nearly every surface. Suzie sniffed between boxes, her snout brushing metal and rubber. She found an old tennis ball wedged beneath a shelf and batted it across the floor, her paws skidding on the concrete as she chased it. She bumped into a metal shelf. A can tipped, then fell. Oil spilled out, spreading quickly across the floor. Suzie stepped into it and slid. She tried to stand and slid again, her paws skidding as she shifted her weight. Nate grabbed a rag and moved toward her. Suzie sat in the oil. Claire came out, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She stopped when she saw Suzie, streaked with oil, leaving a dotted trail of paw prints across the concrete. "Oh no," Claire said, crouching. Suzie came over. Claire lifted her, oil smearing onto her shirt. Inside, Claire filled the tub. Suzie resisted, then settled into the warm water. The oil loosened and ran off in dull swirls. Claire noticed patches along Suzie's coat where the color looked different, specks of brown and gray that hadn't been visible before. She kept rinsing. Claire wrapped Suzie in a towel and set her down. Suzie shook and patted away, damp, tracking water down the hall. Claire stood in the bathroom doorway. The water in the tub was still cloudy. On the floor, faint, oily prints marked where Suzie had crossed earlier. Chapter 7. Kitchen Chaos. It was Saturday afternoon, and Nate was out running errands, leaving Claire and Suzie at home. Claire stood in the kitchen with a pot, making potato soup from scratch. "All right, Suzie," Claire said, lifting the potato. Suzie tilted her head. For a few minutes, she watched Claire, her nose twitching at the smell of raw potatoes, garlic, and freshly washed vegetables. As Claire worked with the peeler, the first few potato skins flew across the counter, and a small pile of uneven chunks quickly accumulated on the cutting board. Claire threw them away and brushed a strand of hair from her face. Suzie trotted around the kitchen, sniffing for something else to do. She went straight to the trash can. The lid was slightly ajar, and inside lay the discarded potato peels. Suzie nudged the lid open and plunged her head inside, pulling out a mouthful of peels. She tossed them into the air. She wagged as she pounced on the scattered pieces. Claire saw the movement and froze. "No, Suzie," Claire said. Suzie looked up with a strip of potato peel hanging from her mouth. Then she bolted across the kitchen, leaving peels in her wake. Claire dropped the peeler and lunged after Suzie, who darted under the table. Claire crouched. Suzie barked and shot out the other side. Claire chased her. Suzie ran under the table again. Claire skidded to a stop. One hand braced against a chair. The potato peels were everywhere now, underfoot, stuck to her socks, pressed damply against the cabinet doors. "Suzie," she said. Suzie paused near the doorway. She dropped the last peel and sat, watching. Claire straightened. Her phone buzzed on the counter, instructing her to start cooking. She looked at the floor, at the counter, at Suzie. Claire lifted the largest pot and set it on the stove, turning the burner and checking the heat. She pushed the peels into a rough pile with her foot and left them there. Suzie crossed the kitchen and lay down where the peels had been. She did not move. The pot began to warm. Claire reached for the salt. Chapter 8. Bites and Licks. "Be back soon," Claire said as she adjusted her dress in the hallway mirror. She and Nate were on their way to a friend's wedding, dressed for the occasion. Suzie sat by the door, watching Claire. Claire bent to scratch behind her ears. "Are you sure she'll be all right on her own?" Claire asked, glancing at Nate. "She'll be fine," Nate said. "It's just a few hours." Claire looked at Suzie once more before they left. "All right," she said. The door clicked shut. Suzie stayed where she was, facing the door. The house was quiet. She let out a small sound and moved from room to room, sniffing along baseboards and furniture legs, pausing where Claire and Nate's scent lingered. She settled by the window, watching the driveway. After a while, Suzie went upstairs to the bedroom. Her foam bed sat in the corner. She approached it and sniffed. She caught the edge of the cover with her teeth and pulled. The bed shifted. She pulled again, dragging it across the floor. Bits of foam worked loose as she tugged. Suzie pulled the bed into the hallway, stopping every few steps to adjust her grip, then down the stairs. The bed bumped along behind her, shedding pieces as it went. She hauled it through the back door and onto the patio. Outside, she lay down on the bed. Soon she began pulling at it again. Foam tore free. She shook it. Pieces lifted into the air and fell around her. She moved through them, pouncing and rolling, snapping at what floated down. The patio filled. Later that evening, Claire and Nate turned back home. From the car, Claire saw white foam spread across the patio, with Suzie in the middle of it. Suzie came toward them. Foam clung to her fur. Behind her, the bed lay open and flattened. Claire crouched and brushed a piece of foam away. Nate stood back. Claire noticed a trail of foam leading toward the stairs and followed it back inside. Upstairs, behind the bedroom curtains, she saw two small holes bored cleanly into the wall. "Nate," she said. He came up beside her. They looked at the holes. Nothing was said. The holes stayed where they were. Chapter 9. Polish Pop. Suzie's ears perked up at a small and precise set of sounds. They were not the sounds most people used. In the Emerson household, commands arrived carefully. They came with a certain softness, a rhythm that bent downward at the end. When Claire spoke, words were never thrown. They were placed. Sian, Zostan, Chodź. These sounds mattered. They meant sit, stay, come. Her body responded first. Outside the house, the system collapsed. Neighbors tried to be helpful. They crouched, they smiled. They raised their voices in encouragement, which made things worse. "Suzie, come on, girl." Suzie paused. She tilted her head. The sentence never finished. English arrived in fragments, sharp edges lifted too high, then dropped. None of it settled into instruction. There was a day when Claire and Nate were out. The gate swung open just enough to suggest permission. Suzie accepted it. She moved down the sidewalk at a reasonable pace, stopping to check the base of trees, the underside of parked cars, the messages left behind by other dogs. The next-door neighbor, Evan, noticed her crossing his driveway. His voice followed her. "Suzie, hey, stop!" Suzie looked back. The sound carried urgency, but no shape. She continued. He watched her for a moment before calling out again. Then he tried, uncertain and careful. "Chodź tu, do domu." Suzie stopped. Her ears lifted, her body turned. She came to him and bumped her head against his leg. Evan guided her toward the house. At the gate, Suzie paused, then stepped through. Chapter 10. Darlings.
Whenever a guest arrived, Suzie would sit beside one person and did not move. Her tailless butt wagged as she shadowed her person from room to room. Among Suzie's favorites was Peter, Claire's assistant, who visited the home office every day. The moment Peter stepped through the door, Suzie was chirping and howling until he acknowledged her. Once he did, she stayed close. She sat beside him and did not move. One day, Peter arrived with a surprise for Suzie, a stuffed Barney the dinosaur toy he'd found at a local shop. She took it from his hands and carried it through the house. She followed Peter while he worked. When he left, she waited by the door. Peter offered to take Suzie to a local dog park, promising Claire that he'd keep a close eye on her. When they returned, Suzie was scratching. "Oh no," Claire said, already assessing the damage. After several baths in flea shampoo, Suzie was still scratching. Claire brought out the electric razor. "Hold still," she said. The cheap razor stalled halfway through, leaving Suzie unevenly shaved. Patches of fur stood up in ridges, too close in some places, untouched in others. Claire shut the razor off and went to the store for another. When she finished, the job was functional. Suzie did not respond to the change. That evening, the house was quiet. Suzie lay on the rug with Barney between her paws. Claire sat nearby. Suzie did not look up. A few years later, Peter moved to England. He wrote occasionally. He sent photos of his own Australian shepherd. In them, the dog ran through fields and along hedges.
Chapter 11. Suzie's New Role. One day, Claire disappeared. One moment she was there, folding clothes in the room. The next, she was gone, leaving only the faintest trace of her scent on the armchair. Suzie searched every room, sniffing door frames and corners, her nose close to the floor. She waited by the door. At night, she curled beside the armchair, pressing her nose to the fabric. Claire's smell remained. The body did not return. A few days later, Suzie's ears lifted at the sound of Nate's keys in the hallway. She rose as he entered the living room. He knelt and touched her neck. "I'm picking Claire up from the hospital," he said. Suzie moved to the window and watched the driveway. When the door opened, the scent reached her first. Claire's, altered, mixed with something unfamiliar. Claire's voice followed, quieter than before. Suzie ran to the entryway and stopped short. Claire stood there, holding a small bundle wrapped in blue fabric. Suzie leaned forward and smelled the air. The new scent was warm and thin, threaded through Claire's. Claire knelt. "This is Ethan," she said. Suzie sniffed the baby's cheek once. Ethan shifted. Suzie stepped back. Since then, on walks around the neighborhood, Suzie stayed close to the stroller. When someone slowed or turned toward it, she barked. At the park, even if some children approached, Suzie moved between them and the stroller and held her position. On the way home, an older man paused to look into the stroller. Suzie stepped forward again, body squared. Claire shortened the leash. "Easy," she said, and kept walking. That night, Suzie lay on the floor beside the couch. A small sound came from the nursery. Claire woke and noticed the space beside the bed was empty. She walked down the hall and stopped in the doorway. Suzie lay on the floor next to the crib, her body turned toward it. Her eyes were open. She did not move. Chapter 12. Superdog. Each night, Suzie stood guard while Claire showered, positioning herself outside the bathroom door. She stood there without shifting. When Claire tried to step out, she often found her path blocked by Suzie's stance. "Suzie, it's okay," Claire said, nudging her aside. Suzie moved only enough to let Claire pass, then returned to her place. This became part of the evenings. Suzie applied the same rule outside. Whenever EJ played in the backyard pool, Suzie stayed alert at the edge. She did not move. If EJ stayed underwater too long, she barked, sharp and immediate. "Suzie," Nate said, touching her head. "He's fine." Suzie did not adjust for reassurance. Suzie stayed where she was.
At other times, the watching continued. EJ was a messy eater, and Suzie waited beneath the high chair. She did not pace, she did not look away. When the first crumb fell, she caught it. When more followed, she stayed ready. Sometimes EJ dropped food deliberately. Suzie took it as it came. "Hey, don't encourage her," Nate said, but he did not move the chair. The system remained in place. Claire noticed the pattern before she named it, and she decided to make use of it. EJ liked his wagon. Suzie was already pulling against the leash on walks. Claire brought out a small harness and fitted it around Suzie's chest, adjusting the straps until they held. Suzie stood while Claire worked and allowed the adjustment. Claire attached the harness to the wagon. EJ climbed in. Claire gave the leash a short cue. Suzie leaned forward and pulled. The wagon moved. Suzie kept moving. Her pace was steady. The strap stayed tight. Claire walked behind them, watching the line between dog and wagon hold. Nothing slackened. EJ assumed this could be repeated. When they returned home, EJ asked to go again. Suzie stood in place. She did not step forward, only corrected her position. EJ sometimes tried to climb onto Suzie's back. Claire stopped him when she saw it. "EJ, no," she said, lifting him away. "Suzie is not a horse." While Suzie tolerated EJ's cowboy antics with patience, there were moments when she clearly felt that enough was enough. If he tried the cowboy routine one too many times, Suzie would move behind him and tugged once at the fabric of his pants. The pull was quick and precise. EJ stumbled and cried out, "Mom, Suzie did it again!" Suzie stayed where she was. Soon, the room went quiet.
Chapter 13. Hide and Seek. Claire and Suzie spent their morning in the neighborhood park. The park was a quiet stretch of Southern California, palms rustling overhead. Suzie walked alongside Claire, pulling forward to sniff the ground, her ears lifting at every sound. Suzie kept her nose low as they moved. Suzie paused without being asked. She noticed a woman in a grass, her attention fixed on a German shepherd. The dog moved with precision, responding immediately to his trainer's commands. "Beautiful dog," Claire said as they passed. "Thank you," the woman replied. "He's in training." Suzie stopped beside Claire and watched. The German shepherd searched the grass and returned, placing an object at his trainer's feet. The woman glanced down at Suzie. Suzie watched. As they walked on, Claire dropped her keys into the grass. She turned. "Where are my keys, Suzie?" Suzie looked at her once, then lowered her nose and began to search. She moved to the spot, nudging the keys with her nose. The task concluded quickly. Claire picked them up and continued walking. Suzie resumed searching as they moved away. Soon, Suzie froze mid-sniff, her nose pointed into the grass. She pawed and let out a low sound. Claire knelt and brushed aside the leaves. A small, bleached skull lay there. Suzie did not lift her head. "Oh, that's Cat," Claire said. Suzie sniffed, then turned away. They continued, with Suzie slightly ahead. Claire decided to take a longer route back home, through the hill. Claire took steps forward before noticing the leash go tight. She turned. Suzie stood with her feet planted, her body angled away from the trail. "Come on," Claire said. Suzie did not move. Suzie converted motion into stillness. Claire waited. The leash stayed taut. Suzie remained where she was and held the position. After a moment, Claire stopped pulling. Claire turned back the way they had come. Suzie released the tension immediately and followed without hesitation. Nothing else was required. Chapter 14. Hunger Strike. When Nate and Claire had to leave for a business trip, they made arrangements for baby EJ and Suzie to stay with Claire's parents, Grandma Eula and Grandpa Andreas. On the day of their departure, Claire packed EJ's toys, wrote out instructions for Suzie's meals and walks, and stood in the hallway. Suzie stayed close to her side. As they were leaving, Claire knelt and held Suzie's face between her hands. "We'll be back soon," she said. "Take care of EJ." Suzie tilted her head. Claire glanced back at the house as they drove away. For the first few days, things appeared to hold. Grandma Eula sent updates. EJ slept. The schedule was followed. Then the messages changed. "Claire," Eula said over the phone, "Suzie isn't eating. She hasn't touched her food." "What?" Claire asked. "Is she sick?" "I don't think so. She stays by the door. She checks on EJ, but she won't eat." Suzie stayed near the entrance. She ignored her bowl, refused toys, and left only to check the crib. Grandma Eula tried coaxing her with chicken. The bowl was set aside. Suzie turned her head away. Over the next days, Eula and Andreas tried what they could think of: eggs, ham, sausage. Each plate was placed down. Each plate was left untouched. "She'll make herself sick," Eula said, watching Suzie turn from another offering. Andreas shook his head. "She'll eat when she needs to." Time passed. The bowls were cleared and set again. In one last attempt, Eula cooked baked fish. She placed it in front of Suzie and waited. Suzie lifted her nose, then lowered it to the floor. That evening, Andreas sat on the rug beside her. He rested a hand on her back and sang quietly an old song he remembered. "Give a dog a hug, it's everyone's best drug. Take a cat onto your knees and give him a kiss. And don't you ever dare to kill any fleas." Suzie's eyes half opening as she listened. Andreas continued. "Stroke a bunny's ear, wipe away your tear. Watch the birds soar high, touching the sky. Love all the beasts, from the largest to the least." Suzie's ears moved once. She did not lift her head. When he stopped, he held out a small treat. Suzie turned away. The day Nate and Claire returned, the front door opened and the air shifted. Suzie rose and moved down the hall. She stopped in front of Claire and pressed her body against her legs. Claire bent down. "Did she eat?" Claire asked. Eula shook her head. "Not once." Chapter 15. Joyride. One afternoon, Nate decided to take Suzie along for a drive to visit an old friend in the neighboring county. He figured it would be a break from routine. When Suzie heard the jingle of his keys, her ears lifted and her tailless butt moved. "Come on, Suzie," Nate said. As he opened the passenger door, Suzie jumped in and settled. Nate started the engine. They pulled onto the freeway with the windows down. Suzie pressed her nose toward the open air. After about 20 minutes, Nate put on a podcast. His eyes stayed on the road. Suzie stayed where she was. They'd been driving for a while when Suzie shifted. She stood, then sat again. She leaned closer. Nate reached over and touched her head without looking. "It's fine," he said. Suzie moved again. She stepped onto the edge of the seat. Before Nate could adjust his grip on the wheel, she climbed forward, her weight sudden and off-center. Her paws slid. One landed against the console, another pressed down. The gear shifter moved. The engine surged and then dropped into a harsh grind. The truck lost momentum, rolling unevenly in the lane. Nate pulled hard on the wheel and coasted to the shoulder. Gravel kicked up under the tires. The engine kept ticking. Cars passed close enough to rock the truck. Suzie stood between the seats, her body still angled forward. Nate stayed where he was, one hand on the wheel. Chapter 16. Gourmand. If there was one thing Suzie took without hesitation, it was sausage. When Nate handed her a slice, she accepted it. Sometimes Nate teased her and slipped a piece of onion among the sausage. Suzie snapped it up and stopped mid-chew, fixing him with a look before spitting it out. In the evening, Suzie caught the smell of chocolate left on the coffee table. She paused, checked the room, and took it. The wrapper was found on the floor the next morning. Suzie sat beside it.
After a day of listlessness and discomfort, Claire took Suzie to the vet. When the car door opened, Suzie smelled the clinic before she saw it. As they turned into the parking lot, she shifted low in the seat. Claire opened the door. "Come on," she said. Suzie braced herself against the upholstery. It took both Claire and Nate to move her. A sickness followed, and Suzie came back to the vet where she stayed overnight. When she woke, she was in a metal cage under fluorescent lights. The air smelled of disinfectant. She lay still until the door opened. She moved carefully. Claire and Nate picked up Suzie and came back home with instructions. Suzie was allergic to both white and red meat. Claire placed a bowl of fish and vegetables on the floor. Suzie sniffed it and turned away. She looked up at Claire. The bowl stayed where it was. Claire hid the pills in cheese. Suzie sniffed the first piece, hesitated, and swallowed. The next one followed. Nate watched. Claire waited until the bowl was empty. Suzie finished and stepped away. Chapter 17. Beach. As Nate finished loading the dishwasher, he glanced out the window. "No marine layer today. Looks sunny. How about the beach?" Claire nodded. "Okay." Suzie reacted at once, her body tightening as Nate gathered towels in the cooler. She watched the movement closely. When the car was ready, Suzie hopped into the back seat and pressed her nose to the window as they drove toward the shore. At the beach, Suzie ran ahead as soon as the door opened. She tore down the sand path, moving fast into the water, then in and out of the waves. She chased a cluster of seagulls near a bed of kelp. The birds scattered. Suzie followed until they lifted out of reach, then turned back, soaked. As they settled, Nate noticed EJ struggling toward the wagon. He stretched and missed his bucket. Suzie paused, then nudged him forward with her snout. EJ fell into the wagon and stayed there, surprised. Nate patted Suzie's shoulder. After digging and playing in the sun, EJ fell asleep under the umbrella. "I'm going to skate the path," Claire said, pulling her skates from the bag. Suzie was beside her before she finished tying them. "All right, Suzie," Claire said, clipping the leash to her wrist. They moved down the boardwalk together. At first, Suzie matched Claire's pace. Then she pulled. The leash tightened. Claire adjusted her balance. "Slow down," she said. Suzie pulled again. The path narrowed. Sand cut across the pavement. Claire released the leash. Suzie ran forward, then stopped and turned when Claire fell behind. Claire reached her a moment later. Suzie was tired, so she poured water into her bowl. They stood there briefly before turning back. As they packed to leave, Suzie wandered toward a low dune with purple flowers. She leaned in. A bee landed and stung her nose. Suzie yelped and backed away. Her face began to swell quickly. "Let's go to the vet," Claire decided. At the emergency vet, Suzie was taken from them. Claire filled out forms. Nate held the leash. The vet returned and explained the allergic reaction. Medication was given. Instructions were handed over. At home, Suzie lay on the floor, her nose still enlarged, her body quiet. Chapter 18. Raccoon's Jazz. Cold air rushed the Emerson family to set up a camp by a babbling creek in the eastern Sierra. Nate pitched the tent, then Andreas helped him to set up a small bonfire, which soon flanked by camping chairs and a hammock. The routine came together as it always did. As darkness settled over the campsite, the bonfire crackled and spat tiny sparks into the night air. Nearby, EJ lay sound asleep, a blanket pulled snugly over his body. Underneath the hammock, Suzie stretched out, her eyes half closed, though her ears flicked at every distant rustle. The stillness of the night was shattered by a sharp rustling in the bushes. Claire reached for her flashlight. The beam of light revealed only swaying leaves. Then it came, the telltale chattering of raccoons, rising above the crackling fire. Nate grinned. "Vandals and thieves. I'll bet they're after Suzie's food." Suzie did not change her position. From the shadows, 3 raccoons emerged, descending a nearby oak tree. Their paws worked as they zeroed in on Susie's food bowl, flipping the lid. Nate and Claire stared as the raccoons, chattering to each other as they steal the dog food. Suzie lay frozen beneath the hammock, her ears flat against her head. The system held. "Seriously?" Nate asked. Suzie maintained the same rule and stayed perfectly still. She breathed slowly, while the raccoons continued their raid on her food canister, flipping the latch with their paws. She tightened her muscles only when Nate decided enough was enough. He shot to his feet, clapping his hands loudly and stomping toward the raccoons. It was then that Suzie sprang to life, barking wildly after them. Startled, the masked thieves run away, their chattering complaints echoing as they scurried into the shadows. Intervention released the response. The rule had worked before. A few summers ago, on a sweltering evening, Claire had left the windows and patio door wide open to let in the breeze. Suzie sprawled across the cool tiles of the kitchen floor as the rest of the family slept soundly upstairs. Claire stirred awake, her ears catching faint rustling noises outside. At first, she thought it might be the wind, but the persistent scratching and shuffling grew louder. She tiptoed downstairs. Entering the kitchen, Claire stopped in her tracks. Suzie lay rigid near the patio door, her eyes wide and unblinking, her body perfectly still. Outside, in soft moonlight, 3 raccoons tore into a forgotten bag of barbecue chips. Claire glanced down at Suzie, who refused to even twitch. The conditions repeated. When Nate and Claire had gone to a concert and EJ was at a friend's sleepover, leaving Suzie alone. The patio door was left open, and EJ's hamsters were outside in their cage. That night, under the cover of darkness, a gang of raccoons crept onto the patio. With their paws, they rattled and clawed at the hamster cage. Inside, Suzie lay stiffly by the glass door and watched as the raccoons tore open the cage. The hamsters scrambled in every direction. Suzie stayed rooted in place, her wide eyes fixed on the unfolding disaster. Suzie held to the rule. The system resumed next morning when EJ returned home with the family. As soon as Suzie heard the car approach, her tailless butt wagged furiously. She barked as they walked through the door. Claire stepped into the kitchen and froze. "What happened here?" she asked, looking at the chaos on the patio. The hamster cage was torn apart, debris scattered everywhere. EJ rushed over. "The hamsters, are they—" The cost became visible. Claire knelt down, sorting through the mess. One hamster was curled up in the bedding, alive but shaken. "EJ, I found one," she called. "But where's the other?" EJ ran outside, searching the yard. His search turned up empty. Accounting was incomplete.
Chapter 19. Bunnies. Suzie wasn't the only 4-legged member of the Emerson household. Nestled in a wooden hutch in the garden were Mike and Suzie, the family's 2 pet bunnies. Black-furred Suzie and caramel-colored Mike drew Suzie's attention. When she was left alone on the patio, she positioned herself beside the hutch and stayed there, head tilted, ears alert. She chose a place and held it. Suzie carried the same placement inside. There was a day when Claire brought the bunnies inside and let them move around the living room. Suzie followed their movement closely. She circled as they hopped, stepping into their paths when they drifted toward the edges of the room. Suzie redirected them with her nose. The bunnies did not settle. Suzie gnawed at the carpet. Mike tried to slip past, only to be redirected again. The room resisted being contained. "All right, Suzie," Claire said, touching her head. "Relax." Suzie lowered herself to the floor, but did not look away. Lowering did not change her position. Suzie adjusted her distance. When Claire lifted one of the bunnies into her lap, Suzie moved closer. She adjusted her position until she was pressed against Claire's leg. Claire shifted the bunny and continued stroking it. Suzie waited. She reached forward and caught the end of Zuz's tail between her teeth. "Suzie?" Claire said, pulling the bunny back. She set Suzie on a chair.
Suzie dropped down and stayed there. The boundary reset at Claire's feet. Suzie's attention sharpened whenever outside. When Claire spent time in the yard, Suzie remained close. When Claire stepped toward the hutch, Suzie followed. When Claire turned away, Suzie stayed where she was. Outside, Suzie widened the perimeter. When other dogs approached the fence, Suzie moved between them and Claire. One afternoon, a golden retriever wandered up, his tail loose and nose pressed to the wire. Suzie stepped forward and held her position, her body squared to the fence. "Easy," Claire said, resting her hand on Suzie's back. Suzie occupied the space between. Suzie did not move until the other dog drifted away. Position restored the quiet. Claire scratched her behind the ears. The yard went quiet again. Chapter 20. Eavesdropping Observer. Suzie positioned herself just outside the living room, her ears perked, listening to Claire and Nate's conversations. She stayed where the voices were clearest. When the sound cut off, she adjusted. The moment a door clicked shut, Suzie positioned herself outside and started scratching the door. The door was an interference. "Suzie, give it a rest," Nate called from inside. But Suzie was undeterred, her tailless butt twitching and redoubling her scratching efforts until someone opened the door. Some noises erased everything else, and even Suzie had her limits, especially when it came to the vacuum cleaner. The moment Claire rolled it out, Suzie's ears flattened, and she eyed the machine, inching backward. Once the vacuum started, Suzie left. Listening was no longer possible there. Earlier that day, the vacuum had sent Suzie fleeing behind the shed. Yet here she was now, planted firmly beneath the sky. Suzie watched each explosion. The booming blasts didn't frighten her. As the sky erupted in colors, Suzie leapt forward, barking as if to challenge the fireworks to come closer, her eyes fixed on the bursts of color above. She answered what she could hear. She bounced on her paws, yapping at the sky as another firework cracked open the sky. Suzie barked again, once, sharp and deliberate, then paused. When the noise finally tapered off, Suzie stopped barking. She sniffed the air once, as if checking whether the sky had finished speaking, then turned and trotted back toward the house. She did not look relieved. She did not look proud. She scratched once at the door. Chapter 21. Kittens. While Suzie ignored the garden animals, her attitude changed the day she met an unexpected visitor, the neighbor's white cat, Patched Gray. The cat wandered into the garden one afternoon and curled up on the patio chair. Suzie noticed the cat only after Claire did. Claire greeted the cat with a pat. Suzie approached cautiously, body tense, ears back, and sniffed the new arrival. The cat returned her gaze and began grooming itself. Suzie sniffed, then looked up at Claire. She checked Claire's position before holding her own. The cat blinked once and moved over to Claire, rubbing its head against her legs. Suzie let out a low huff. The space beside Claire changed. The next morning the cat returned, curling up on the same patio chair. Suzie padded over and stood beside the chair. The cat barely glanced her way. Suzie barked once. The cat jumped down and slipped back through the garden fence. For the moment, the balance reset. Attention shifted all at once. There came a day Claire walked in carrying a small, fluffy creature with enormous eyes and a twitchy pink nose. "Everyone, meet Mitten," Claire said. Suzie froze. She watched as EJ squealed, as Nate nodded, as Claire nuzzled the kitten's head. With every "Mitten," Suzie watched Claire cooing over the kitten's movements, Nate scratching Mitten's ears, as EJ giggled when Mitten batted at his fingers. Suzie could not find a place that held. Suzie brought Claire her favorite toy and dropped it at her feet. Offering did not relocate the attention. Claire dangled a feather toy for Mitten and did not notice. Suzie paced the room. Each time she moved closer, the kitten was already there. The problem continued without a place to stand. A few weeks later, Suzie dreamed. In the dream, Mitten balanced on an old longboard in the pool while Claire and EJ pushed it from either side. The kitten stayed still at first. Then the board drifted. A yowl, a splash, frantic paddling, escape. Suzie woke herself with a quiet snort. That day, Mitten vanished. No announcement, no search. Just an empty spot where the kitten's bowl had been. The position never reopened. Nate woke with his face swollen nearly shut. Claire fetched antihistamines. Suzie responded as if nothing had changed. She greeted Nate the same way she always did, tailless rump wagging, nose lifted.
Chapter 22. Hiking. Done, Claire declared as she adjusted the baby carrier with EJ snug inside, his little face peeking over her shoulder. After stuffing her backpack with water, snacks, and diapers, she turned to Suzie. Now your turn. The weight was already assigned. Claire strapped a doggy backpack onto Suzie, tightening it around her chest and back. The nylon pressed against her fur. Suzie shifted, wrinkling her nose. The pack did not come off. Don't even start, Claire said. You're a strong breed. You can handle it. She patted Suzie's head as if that settled it. Come on, it's just your water bowl in there. Suzie stayed where she was. She tested whether the load was negotiable. The trail was dry. Claire stepped forward, already moving with EJ. Let's go, Suzie. Suzie did not follow. Claire stopped. Suzie? She waited. Suzie moved, slow and deliberate. She accepted motion, not weight. Suzie walked behind Claire, the pack shifting with each step. The path stretched on. Dust clung to her legs. When they reached a shallow creek, Suzie moved ahead and lay down in the water. She did not look back. The body intervened where instruction did not. All right, Claire called. Take a break. Suzie stayed there. On the return, Suzie took the lead. Her pace quickened. Claire asked her to slow down. Suzie did not. By the time they reached the parking lot, she kept moving until the leash checked her. Speed replaced negotiation. In the car, Suzie jumped into the back seat and turned her head toward the window. Claire reached back. Suzie did not respond. Contact did not reduce the weight. The load was treated as precedent as the hikes continued after that. Different trails, longer distances. Suzie followed at first, her steps steady. One time, Claire decided to climb toward a mountain pass. The ground grew uneven. Dust worked into Suzie's paws. She slowed. Claire continued. After several hours, they reached the pass. Claire stopped and looked out. She touched Suzie's head gently. Suzie stood still. Distance accumulated faster than recovery. The descent began. The path was steeper. Each step jarred her legs. Then Suzie stopped. She lay down in the sand and turned her head away. Gravity finished what weight began. Claire knelt beside her. Come on, she said. Suzie did not move. Claire left her in the shade and ran back toward the trailhead. She reached the trailhead and finally got a signal, calling Nate to come with the truck. Suzie's too tired to walk, she explained quickly. On my way, Nate replied, and Claire breathed a sigh of relief. Nate arrived with the truck. They lifted Suzie into the back. She lay where they placed her. The load transferred only after failure. Suzie kept her head turned toward the window. Claire reached back to touch her. Suzie shifted farther into the corner and stayed there. The body remained unavailable. Chapter 23. Desert. The Emersons went for another desert escape, open skies and sand dunes. The only sounds were the distant cries of birds and the whisper of wind across the sand. Suzie ran across the desert with her nose to the ground, sniffing bushes and rocks. The space offered nothing to hold her still. When the quad started up,
She ran alongside it, barking. Her gaze locked onto the tires. She snapped once at the rubber, then fell back, then surged forward again. Movement drew her faster than sound. "Watch for Suzie," Nate called. Claire tightened her grip and steered away. Suzie darted forward anyway, crossing too close to the front wheel. She corrected toward motion, not away from it. The tire clipped her. Suzie rolled in the sand and came up coughing dust. She shook herself and moved back toward the quad, staying close. Claire stopped the engine and ran to her. She checked Suzie. Suzie stood and stepped away, returning to her place near the quad. Stopping had not entered the sequence. In hope to avoid this kind of situations, Nate built EJ a small motorcycle with a sidecar. They tried once to strap Suzie in. She avoided it after that, running beside the bike instead, matching its speed until she tired. Containment failed when it interrupted speed. The sand was already warm when Claire took Suzie hiking through the hills. The desert had changed after rain. Flowers covered the ground. Suzie moved ahead, nose down, focused. Forward remained the only instruction she followed. Claire noticed movement on the ridge. 3 coyotes stood there, still. Their eyes were fixed on the trail. Stillness registered only as distance. Suzie did not look up. Her body stayed committed to the line she was already on. "Suzie," Claire said. Voice did not alter trajectory. Suzie kept sniffing. The task continued, uninterrupted. The coyotes moved. Claire tightened the leash and pulled. Suzie resisted, then lifted her head. Claire moved faster, heading for a large boulder. She and Suzie ducked behind it and stayed still. Control returned only by borrowing cover. The coyotes stopped on the ridge. They watched. They did not come closer. Claire looked back. The coyotes were still there. Distance held longer than authority. Next day, the coyote was closer. It stepped into view without hesitation. Claire shouted. Nate waved his arms. Proximity collapsed the pause. Suzie saw it and lunged forward. She ran straight at it, barking, jaws snapping. The coyote shifted, then ran. Suzie followed until it disappeared into brush. Claire called her name. Suzie kept running. Acceleration replaced judgment. EJ cried and clung to Nate's leg. Claire stood with the leash in her hand. Suzie moved ahead of them, alert, watching the empty distance where the coyote had been. She held the forward position after control ended. When Suzie came back, she did not slow. She circled, scanning the desert, moving in short bursts. Claire reached for her. Suzie pulled away and continued pacing. Momentum no longer required a target.
Chapter 24. Camping. Long shadows covered the family's tents when they camped in the heart of the sequoias. The redwoods stood with their gnarled trunks, scarred by time and fire, still radiating a quiet strength. Beneath their canopy, the family's bright red tents looked like tiny berries scattered across the forest floor. As they settled into their campsite, Suzie moved quickly through the trees, nose pressed to the ground, zigzagging between roots and fallen needles. Every rustling leaf and faint scent pulled her in a new direction. Claire watched her, smiling. "What do you think, Suzie?" she called. Suzie did not respond. Suzie moved as if the forest had already begun speaking. As the sun sank behind the trees, the sky shifted into pink and amber. Around the fire Nate and Grandpa Andreas had built, the family gathered. The flames snapped and crackled, embers lifting into the cooling air. The smell of sausages and marshmallows drifted through the clearing. EJ laughed as his marshmallow collapsed into flame. Suzie moved around the perimeter of the firelight, circling, stopping, listening. Later, she lay down near the edge of the light, head on her paws. The quiet did not register as absence. When the fire burned low, the night changed. The light narrowed, but Suzie's attention did not. Her ears lifted. She stood. Her body stiffened, angled toward the darkness beyond the trees. A low sound came from her chest.
just enough to stop the talking. Nate reached for the lantern and raised it. "Suzie?" he said. She did not look at him. Her posture held. The sound came again, deeper this time. Nate turned the lantern toward the space between the tents. The beam shook slightly as it moved. At first, there was nothing, only tree trunks and shadow. Then the darkness shifted. A shape separated itself from the trees. Black fur caught the edge of the light, large, still. The light followed its posture. No one spoke. The bear stood just beyond the reach of the lantern, its body heavy and indistinct, breath moving slow and audible. Suzie barked once. The sound carried into the trees and stopped. The bear shifted its weight. It turned its head slightly. After a moment, it stepped away from the light. Branches cracked. The shape dissolved back into shadow. No one moved. Suzie held the change in place. Stillness answered stillness. Nate lowered the lantern. Claire's hand stayed tight on EJ. Grandma Eula did not speak. Grandpa Andreas stared at the dark space where the bear had been. No one mistook quiet for clearance. Suzie did not lie down. She moved in a slow circle around the tents, stopping often, sniffing the ground, lifting her head to listen. She marked the perimeter again and again. Nate added wood to the fire. The flames rose, but the clearing felt smaller. Nate said quietly, "Let's go to sleep." Inside the tent, Claire lay awake, listening. Each time the sounds came and went, wind, branches, something heavier farther off, Suzie shifted inside. Rest was attempted, not granted. The listening continued without light. When they stepped out of the tent in the morning, the ground around the campsite was marked. Large tracks pressed deep into the dirt, circling the fire pit, crossing close to the tents. One passed within a foot of the fabric wall. The ground confirmed what had not ended. No one said anything. Suzie stood near the edge of the clearing, nose lifted, watching the trees. She did not relax when the sun rose. Daylight did not interrupt her watch.
Chapter 25. Beauty Parlor. Suzie moved through open fields and untamed woods, darting through tall grasses with her fur lifting in the wind. Claire watched her hurry ahead. Hidden in the fields was foxtail grass. What moved freely began collecting residue. The seeds lodged in Suzie's coat. The damage declared itself slowly. Over the next days, Suzie slowed. Her belly swelled. Claire took her to the vet. X-rays showed multiple foxtails embedded in her skin. Surgery was scheduled. When Claire left her at the clinic, Suzie watched her go. Suzie endured the procedure. Afterward, she returned groggy, the seeds removed. She slept. At home, Claire sat beside her and rested a hand on Suzie's head. She said to Nate, "We should take her to a professional groomer." Nate looked at her. "You used to do it yourself." "I can't keep up anymore," Claire said. "Her coat's too thick. The vet said regular grooming matters." Nate nodded. "It'll be easier." Care shifted from watching to scheduling. Another system took custody. Suzie's first visit to the groomer took longer than expected. Outside the door, she stopped. The smell of disinfectant drifted out. Claire pulled gently on the leash. Suzie did not move. Claire lifted her. Inside, dogs barked, water ran, clippers buzzed. Suzie stood in the bath and held still. During the brushing and trimming, she watched the door. Stillness became the required posture. The intervention extended beyond the tools. The groomer tied a scarf around Suzie's neck and sprayed perfume. Suzie wrinkled her nose. Claire returned and clipped the leash on. "You're done," she said. Outside, Suzie lowered herself into the grass and rolled until the scent faded. The scent was reduced, not removed. During another camping trip, the environment resumed its claims again. Claire arrived to find Suzie waiting near the tents. When she knelt, she saw the ticks. They were embedded across Suzie's coat. Claire removed them one by one. Suzie sat still. Risk was narrowed, not eliminated. Back home, Claire brought Suzie to the groomer again. She said, "No scarf, no perfume, just a bath and a shave." Suzie came back with her coat shortened. She lay down and slept. Claire sat nearby, smelling the doggy shampoo faded. Maintenance concluded. Chapter 26. Walks. Claire sat at her computer, typing or murmuring into her headset. Suzie waited nearby. The door stayed closed. Suzie looked at it. Her tailless rump moved once. She pulled a crumpled paper from the trash and carried it across the room. When Claire did not look up, Suzie dropped it and waited. She picked it up again and stood closer. "Not now, Suzie," Claire said without turning. The signal went unreceived. Suzie held the paper, then let it fall. The exchange closed without reply. Lack of movement substituted for response. Mornings meant walks. They went out at the same time each day. Claire pushed EJ in the stroller while Suzie walked close in the park. Then a rabbit crossed the path. Suzie stiffened, then lunged. The leash went tight. Claire was pulled forward. She caught herself on the stroller handle and stood still until Suzie stopped straining. "Suzie," she said. Soon the same thing happened. This time, Claire released the leash. Suzie ran a short distance, then slowed, distracted by the brush. When Claire caught up, an animal services van was parked nearby. An officer stepped out and wrote a ticket. Claire took it and folded it without reading. The interaction converted into a record. Halfway down the sidewalk stood the yellow pole. One day, when they reached it, Suzie stopped. She placed herself beside it and looked back toward the house. Suzie waited for recognition, not direction. Claire paused, then tugged on the leash. Suzie did not move. Claire turned around. They walked back the way they had come. Procedure answered in place of acknowledgement. Another day, farther down the park, Suzie chased a frisbee. The officer appeared again. He measured the leash. He wrote more. Claire listened and nodded. She put the paper in her pocket. Rules repeated where recognition had not. After that, avoidance replaced adjustment, and Claire changed the routine. Mornings stayed close to the park. Afternoons shifted to the hills, where there were no signs and fewer people. Suzie moved more freely there, though she did not go far. One afternoon, Claire walked along the hilltop path. Suzie wandered ahead, stopping often. Claire talked, mostly to herself. She stopped without meaning to. "Suzie?" she said. There was no answer. A faint jingle came from farther down the path. Suzie was already heading home, dust lifting behind her. Claire followed, watching the dust settle before it disappeared. Chapter 27. Feelings. EJ adored Suzie, yet affection did not establish direction. Each time he tried to take charge, her quiet resistance met him without comment. At 12, EJ decided to take Suzie to the soccer field. The plan assumed agreement that had not been checked. Other kids were bringing their dogs. He took the leash and went out the door. They didn't get far. Distance failed before movement began. Their pace never synchronized. Suzie stopped just outside the house, her tailless butt moving uncertainly. EJ tugged lightly on the leash. "Come on, Suzie." She lowered her head and pushed her nose into the nearest bush. He waited. He tugged again. Suzie did not look at him. She finished sniffing and moved a few inches forward, then stopped again. EJ checked his watch. Suzie moved as if time were not part of the arrangement. Waiting widened the gap instead of closing it. They arrived already misaligned. Suzie kept the space that still fit. By the time they reached the field, the others were already there. Dogs sat or paced near their owners, leashes loose. "This is Suzie," EJ said. Suzie stayed close to his leg. Her ears flattened slightly.
She watched the other dogs without moving. When EJ tugged the leash, she stepped back. The field compressed faster than she adjusted. A Labrador approached, his tail wagging. Suzie stiffened. A low sound came from her chest. Another dog moved closer. Suzie barked once and snapped. EJ pulled the leash short. Suzie surged forward. The leash slipped from his hand. She ran. Alignment collapsed. Exit replaced negotiation. The field fell away behind her. The voices faded. Suzie moved fast, breath sharp, choosing streets she knew. When she reached the house, the door was open. She went inside, drank from her bowl, and lay down on the kitchen tiles. The system resolved itself. EJ stood where he was. He started after her, then slowed. He stopped running before the path ended. Following was no longer possible. When EJ stumbled through the front door, his face was red and streaked with tears. Claire, folding laundry at the dining table, looked up sharply. "What happened, honey?" she asked, stroking his hair as his sobs shook his small frame. EJ sniffled, his voice breaking as he tried to explain. "She ran away, Mom, right in front of everyone. I told her to stop, I called her back, but she didn't listen. They all laughed at me," he whispered. "I looked so stupid." Claire smoothed his hair, her voice calm. "It's okay, sweetheart." EJ shook his head. "I don't think I can take her out again," he muttered. "Not after that." Claire squeezed his hand.
Chapter 28. Hidden Messages. "Nate, you won't believe it." Claire burst into the room. Nate glanced up from the car manual he was studying. "What's the big news?" "I've got tomorrow off," Claire said. "A full Saturday with nothing scheduled." Nate smiled. "So what's the plan?" "I was hoping to do something outdoorsy," Claire said. "A long trek, maybe?" Nate leaned back. "You deserve it. EJ and I will be fine." The next morning, Claire and Suzie left just after sunrise without an objective. The hills were washed in soft pink and gold. Suzie launched out of the car before the leash was clipped, nose already working the air, pulling hard toward the brush. "Hold on," Claire said, laughing as she followed. Suzie moved swiftly. The trail wound through pepper trees heavy with red berries. Claire crushed a few between her fingers and breathed in the sharp scent. Suzie returned briefly to investigate Claire's hand, then bounded ahead again. Claire followed the scent rather than the path. Farther on, the remains of an old house appeared, a lone brick fireplace, blackened and leaning, moss climbing its sides. Suzie disappeared into the tall grass around it, nose buried deep. Claire leaned against a tree and waited. But waiting did not replay inspection. Nearby, a rope swing hung from an oak. Claire eased onto it. The rope creaked. The swing moved. She closed her eyes for a moment. Motion happened without instruction. They continued toward the lake. Suzie reached the water first, wading in and splashing with a stick clenched in her mouth. Claire settled into a red Adirondack chair near the shore. Something pale caught her eye. A scrap of paper lay beside a cigarette butt. Claire picked it up and smoothed it flat. "Get off to a new start. Come out of your shell." She folded it and set it back down. Claire did not answer the sentence. They walked on. At the far side of the lake, Suzie again tugged something loose from beneath a weathered chair. Claire took it from her mouth. Another slip of paper. "To whoever reads this, it is okay." Claire placed it back where she found it. Repetition asked for no response. They moved along the path. Suzie slowed, then stopped. In the grass ahead lay the hind legs of a rabbit. Suzie sniffed, then looked up. The finding required nothing further. Suzie had already stepped past the grass. Claire followed, pensive. They reached the car without Claire speaking. On the drive home, Suzie slept with her nose against the door. Silence resumed its place. That evening, Claire sat beside Nate, scrolling through photos.
When she paused on the image of the rabbit legs, Nate glanced over. "What's that?" Claire couldn't resist. "Once upon a time," she began, then continued, "once there was a wild rabbit so spry, whose jokes often strayed into a bad supply. One day the wild rabbit, in a foolish spree, crossed bounds with an old and proud coyote. The wild rabbit, completely foolish, ventured far with his words quite bullish. Under the oak's shade, in the morning light, the rabbit mocked Coyote with all his might. "Stop it," Coyote warned, his patience thin, yet wild rabbit persisted, lost in his grin. The rabbit taunted Coyote under the sun's warm glow, blind to the danger, unwilling to know. Coyote's patience wore thin, his temper did rise, as rabbit's taunts reached some new highs. With a warning growl, Coyote spoke clear, "Stop this folly, Rabbit, have some fear." But Rabbit, heedless, continued his game, unaware of the danger, blind to his shame. With a voice stern and fit, Coyote then said, "If you persist, I'll catch you, don't be misled. Last chance, Rabbit, run or take your final hike." Coyote paused, his claws poised to strike. "You've got a slow growl, but I've got quick feet. Catch me if you can, if you even dare to compete." The rabbit laughed, too breathless to speak, but with fangs bared, the coyote was quick. With a swift, sharp snap, Rabbit's fate was sealed. No more taunts, no more games, just silence revealed. Claire locked the phone and set it aside.
Chapter 29. Fire Trophies. A heavy smoke thickened the sky, smothering the town in a gray veil. The acrid stench of burning brush clung to the air, sharp and relentless. Residents gathered in uneasy clusters, their murmurs punctuated by worried glances toward the hills, where wild flames had devoured the landscape. Claire stood among them, her chest tight. The desert wind howled, fanning what was left. Firefighters moved along the perimeter, their silhouettes flickering against the scorched ground. The fire had been contained. When the smoke cleared, the hills Claire had loved were left blackened and bare. Containment did not restore what had been altered. A week later, Claire returned to the hills. Suzie trotted beside her. Where chaparral and sagebrush once grew, only ash remained, gray, brittle, flattened. Claire stopped, looking longer than she meant to. The air still carried smoke. Even the birds were quiet. She remembered walking here before, the smell of crushed sage on her fingers. Now the ground gave nothing back. The land remained available in its changed state. Suzie sniffed along the slope, her nose low, working the soil with methodical attention. Her tailless rump moved once as she pawed at the ash, uncovering something pale. Claire crouched. It was a scorched jawbone, bleached and intact. She hesitated, then looked around. Nearby lay more, fragments of skull, ribs, and other pieces pulled free by the fire and left where they fell. Claire gathered them without comment, placing them together on a flat patch of stone. Exposure continued without intention. When they returned home, ash streaked their clothes and fur. Nate glanced up from his book. "Rough hike?" "The hills are empty," she said. Claire set the bones on the patio table. Suzie shook herself. Ash drifted and settled again. After dinner, Claire went outside to inspect her collection. Suzie lay sprawled by the table, happily gnawing on the largest bone, her teeth scraping against the scorched surface. The rest of the pile was scattered across the patio, some pieces broken, others missing entirely. "Suzie!" Claire shouted, hands on her hips. Suzie looked up mid-chew, her ears perking. Nate snorted. "So, dinner and dessert, huh?" Claire grabbed the bone from Suzie's jaws. "Unbelievable," she muttered. EJ asked, "Did she just eat a deer and a coyote?" "Not all of it," Claire sighed, holding up the slobbery, half-chewed bone. Just the tastiest bits, apparently. Has the world ever heard of a dog dining on coyote and deer in one sitting? Nate shook his head. Suzie wagged her tailless butt. Her satisfaction was written all over her soot-streaked face. She gave them a satisfied look and lay on the warm concrete, licking the last ash from her lips as though she'd just conquered a great feast. Claire stood where she was. The patio smelled faintly of smoke. Chapter 30. Getting Older. Claire began to notice the quiet signs of Suzie's aging. The spring in her step softened into a steady shuffle, her once rich, dark coat peppered with gray, and her favorite pastime became long naps in the sun, undisturbed by the household's movement. Nothing required intervention yet. Claire called Suzie for dinner, expecting the familiar sound of paws in the hallway. The house stayed quiet. Claire found her by the window, sitting still, her gaze fixed on the fading light. Claire said her name again. Suzie did not turn. Claire knelt and placed a hand on her shoulder. Suzie shifted slightly, then looked away. When Claire moved her hand into Suzie's line of sight, Suzie followed it without confusion. The change asked for closer positioning. In time, other sounds stopped reaching her as well. The vacuum cleaner no longer sent her scrambling. The air compressor passed without reaction. Suzie spent more hours by the window, tracking the light as it crossed the floor. The family began using hand signals. Doors were closed more carefully. Movement slowed around her. The house adjusted before anyone named it. Food remained legible. When Claire opened a package or reached for a sausage, Suzie appeared, standing close, waiting. "She's got 1 cent left," Nate said, watching her nose work across the room. Then came the first seizure. One moment Suzie stood, the next her legs folded beneath her. Her body stiffened and convulsed against the floor. Claire knelt beside her and waited. Suzie could not hear. Claire kept one hand against her side until the movement passed. When it ended, Suzie lay still, breathing shallowly, then began to recover her balance. Waiting became the correct response. Long walks were canceled. Corners of rooms became destinations. Sometimes Suzie stopped mid-step and stared at the wall, as if expecting something. Claire guided her gently back toward the door when this happened. Distance was shortened rather than resisted. Sleep arrangements changed. Someone was always nearby. EJ walked with her from room to room. Nate left treats in her bed at night. Claire slept beside her in the guest room. Proximity replaced independence as care rerouted itself. Suzie did not protest. She followed what was placed in front of her. She rested when she stopped. She remained where she was. Chapter 31. Farewell. A broken-winged red hawk appeared in the garden one day. It stood beneath the tree, its body hunched low, one wing dragging in the dirt. Its feathers were uneven, its gaze unfocused. Nate, Claire, and EJ approached slowly and stopped a few steps away. The hawk did not move. The body made its condition plain. Nate fetched a bowl of water and set it down at a distance. After a moment, the hawk leaned forward and drank. Claire called the local wildlife center. An officer arrived and examined the bird, turning it with practiced hands. He shook his head. "It's too badly hurt to ever fly again," he said. "The kindest option is to let it pass." The decision followed what had already been shown. The officer wrapped the hawk in a towel and carried it to his truck. EJ stood at the edge of the driveway. Soon, Suzie began to fade. She turned away from her food. She drank less. The family recognized the pattern before they spoke it. When Suzie stopped responding to familiar sounds, they arranged for a vet to come to the house. The vet examined her. Suzie was reaching the end. There was nothing to treat. Her breathing slowed. EJ sat beside her,
his small hand pressed to her side. They knelt beside Suzie. The vet administered the sedative. Epilogue. Claire leaned back, her fingers hovering above the final sentence of her story. She touched the screen, then closed the laptop. The room stayed quiet. She stood and stepped outside. The garden was still a mess. Weeds crowded the edges, dead palm fronds lay tangled with fallen branches. Claire pulled on a pair of gloves and began clearing the debris. When a small patch of soil was exposed, she went to the garage and retrieved a few crumpled bags of poppy seeds. She had bought them and never planted them. Claire knelt and scattered the seeds, pressing them into the soil. The ground was cool and loose. She smoothed the surface until the seeds were no longer visible. She straightened and looked toward the hills, their slopes bare, unchanged. She brushed her hands together. Claire stood there. Then she went inside.